You missed your whole thing when talking about Lamar.
It
If you
doesn't
want to
matter.
do it again.
It doesn't matter.
No, I just started it again. It was good. We should talk about it. Somehow the camera wasn't on.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was just saying the documentary I thought was good because it gave you a lot of basic stuff you could work with. And it was generally suggesting that she was crushed down when it came to her invention of, I don't know what it was, frequency switching or something like that. Because she was a woman. Well,
I have to flip my stuff. You just talk to the camera, okay? No, it's a good rant. You should talk about it.
well, it's not really a rant.
Well, no, whatever. A speech, whatever. Good. You're providing good information, good insight about what you...
Well, it's a different take on it.
Okay.
Anyway,
That's good.
a rough contemporary of hers was a guy called Leo Szilard. He's the guy who, by all accounts, came up with the idea of chain reaction when it came to nuclear processes. And apparently this was like within a year of a neutron being discovered. So he was able to conceive of a neutron chain reaction. Neutrons causing a chain reaction, splitting atoms. So he was a left-winger, quite possibly a communist, definitely from the accounts we got after the Cold War from Russian documents that were only opened in the 90s. It looks as though he was not just a communist sympathizer, but an unpaid, in other words, very silly communist agent for the KGB of all things. He worked on the Manhattan Project, gave secrets away. But he applied and for a patent on the chain reaction process. And I can recall reading one right-wing commentator, this is quite recently, perhaps even this century, saying, oh, he was a ridiculous figure. No, he's ridiculous when he came to being an agent, especially unpaid for the KGB. But this right-wing commentator, I can't remember the name of the fellow, he said he was ridiculous. He was so silly he applied for a patent on the chain reaction process. And he wasn't ridiculous. He was actually making a point. He knew, I suspect, that there's no way they'd give it to just a regular Joe. Of course, it wasn't a regular Joe, but a regular Joe in the sense that he didn't have any money. And what they told him was, hey, do you have the means of actually producing one of these chain reaction processes? Of course, the answer was no. And their answer was, of course, no, get lost, because you've got to have the means of making it, which is basically saying you've got to have money in order to make money. And that's why I say he knew what he was doing. He was making a point. But you can imagine what would happen, what his estate would have been like. I think he died fairly early. If he'd had the rights to every, at least partial rights to every nuclear process. Of course, there'd be the bombs and stuff like that. I'm talking mainly about all the energy produced by nuclear reactors. It's stunning. And of course, what they did is they stole his idea. And it would be the American government enabling and facilitating not just American entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurs in France and elsewhere in England to make a fortune or fortunes off of Leo Szilard's idea. So this wasn't just confined to it wasn't Leo Szilard was a gay fellow, I guess, a little Jewish fellow, Hungarian fellow, an immigrant. But it's just, it's more of a socio-economic thing, really an economic thing, not so much a gender issue. There are all sorts of gender issues, but Hedy Lamarr had a lot of money and things like that. And she was crushed by the studio system, but so was Elvis Presley. They got her hooked on drugs and things like that. It was the U.S. military, I think, that started Elvis on his road downhill using amphetamines.
Try a little bit of
And,
this to let the people know about that, because it's I put the coconut water in there. It's really thick.
It's pretty good.
Okay, that's all.
And you know, like when
I'll
you
put it back in the fridge now.
okay, thanks. When you look at her idea, really, one of the tragedies of her life seems to be that her second marriage didn't work out. Didn't catch exactly why it fell apart, but really her invention was a co-invention. This isn't to diminish or demean her or diminish her achievement when it came to it. She had the idea, and then the way it was realized, it involved two other people, a husband, and then someone I think her husband knew, an engineer. Both of them are male, of course. And her husband had already, he was a musician, a composer, and he'd used pianolas, or player pianos, another term for it. And what you use is little, almost like old computer punch-out cards for these pianolas or player pianos. And that's the kind of technology that they used for this frequency shifting, I think is what it was called. And so Ship would have it, and there'd be a comparable thing in a torpedo. And what I mean by comparable, it would be the same score ultimately on the ship and the torpedo. And
if you're needing more water, you can have mine.
They'd be able to match up their messages based on this duplicated score. So I don't think they emphasized enough the contribution her husband made. I think the important thing, one of the important messages to take from this is the importance of teamwork. And it is kind of silly, I think, to be looking for, in cases like this, we're looking for who originated the idea, because the idea came from, she got the idea from scanning apparently across the radio, across radio frequencies, so that had already been thought of. And then her husband brought this technology, player pianos, from his experience. Well, someone else had thought that up. And I'm not so sure that little technology didn't come from Belgian weavers, where they'd almost computerized things. This goes back a long way, using these kind of punched out cards and stuff like that. So this idea of prior invention is a little bit cooked. It is important to put ideas together, and this is what her husband and she and the engineer they got to kind of realize it did, working together. There's not enough of that kind of creativity happening. Generally, you get into a university community, understand professors tend to be a lot more intelligent, in some cases innovative than the average schmuck. But even they aren't what people could be or should be. Everyone should be an inventor, everyone should be a scientist, everyone should be an artist, frankly. Everyone should be creative, but creativity is crushed. And not just in schools, it's crushed by parents. Kids are given poor answers to their many, many questions.
But then there's the internet now, so they can find many poor answers to their many, many questions.
Exactly.
And a few good ones.
Well, it's very hard to find good answers, but it's amazing when you try to find just information about anything. You know, it's not just finding the real fake news or whatever. It's, for example, what was I trying to find recently? Well, that's not a good example because some people could be offended by has to do with religion. Let me think. What else was that? Oh yeah, this one only scientists would be offended by. So I was talking to a philosophy prof recently, and I was talking about he kind of specializes in quantum theory and stuff like that. And he's messed around, it looks like, with relativity. And when I say mess around, it'd be like the University of Toronto. He's actually got a degree for this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, it's not a degree of freedom. It's a degree of unfreedom. But he's come up with some equation which he thinks has proven that it's possible to faster motion faster than the speed of light. And that doesn't impress me. I mean, he's working from some crazy assumptions that quantum physicists make. And of course, you're going to come up with crazy equations when you got crazy assumptions. And all his equation, I'm pretty sure he's done the math right, proves, if indeed he's done the math right, is that quantum physics is a crop. So it's quantum metaphysics, as I call it, which is basically metaphysics is the proper field of investigation for philosophers, not for physicists. But his little equation, if it proves to be valid, just disproves quantum theory. All it takes is one thing to disprove whole swatches of it, if not all of it. But I have no problem with there being stuff moving faster than the speed of light. If something, according to the findings of Alfvén, who won a Nobel Prize roughly in 1970, physicist, astrophysicist, for a charged particle moving in outer space, a vacuum like outer space, it's kind of, for that charged particle, a little bit like a regular particle moving through syrup. Slows it down. But non-charged particle, outer space, a vacuum like outer space, not going to slow it down. So when I hear reports, this is from long ago, about neutrinos arriving from the sun faster than they should be arriving, in other words, faster than the speed of light, I just say, nah, so what? It's only to be expected. But of course, for a quantum theory, and especially someone who's into relativity, where Einstein, this great genius from doing work 100 years ago, over 100 in 1905, beginning 1905, he kind of set the speed limit for light. So when he's talking to Bohr or something like that, and he says, God doesn't, roughly translated to something like, God doesn't throw dice or stuff like that. God doesn't resort to chance. It's almost like he was saying, talking about himself as God. He was used to setting limits to things. He's definitely, at the very least, God's prophet. And anyway, this wee little prof was thought I was talking about something done, I think, in 2011, somewhere there, and retracted in 2012, where some physicists somewhere, they were technologists, had done some experiments where the results indicated that some things were going I guess it was neutrinos, were going nano miles per second faster than the speed of light. And then they found out that, they'd made a few mistakes in terms of their equipment and so on and so forth, maybe a few mistakes in terms of interpretation. And I hate it when theoreticians, and that includes this nutty little prof out of the university, I mean, he'd be a theoretician about theoretical physics. Pretty sad case. But, I hate it when they're always setting themselves up above people are actually doing the work, technologists. And so it's a little bit like, I think it's fairly accurately represented when you look at Big Bang theory. I mean, I'm talking about the psychological aspect of it. You got this theoretical physicist, Sheldon Cooper, arrogant as all get out, lording it over Howard, who's the technologist I presume it's Caltech. I think they always talk about it being Pasadena. I think that's where Caltech is located. So, yeah, I find it offensive. These guys, these technologists are working really hard to come up with experiments and stuff like that, and things are going to go wrong. And the important thing is, these guys made some mistakes and they retracted them. It's hard to retract stuff. It's going to be very hard for people who've been besotted for so long with the relativity theory and quantum metaphysics, or I call them quantum mechanics. I don't call quantum physics quantum mechanics. I call the dudes that do it quantum mechanics. And that's not just an indication of how the degree to which they're flunkies. It's an indication of how much they're handing you a crock, because you can't trust a mechanic, and you know it. You can't trust a quantum mechanic. Anyway, it did end up being somewhat of a rant, but these guys, I think Sheldon Cooper actually was named after Sheldon Glashow. It's instructive to read his wee little autobiography, where he's just full of himself. And unfortunately, what his self is full of, I'm not going to say exactly, but you can imagine.
I disagree with you about the you can't trust a mechanic thing. I mean, I could trust my dad.
Yeah, but was your dad a professional mechanic, right?
Well, it could have been had he cared.
It could have been. And he, as with anything, you can always find people who are honest and above board. But the typical mechanic is like the typical professional arborist. How many top trees? How many what percentage? I'm sure there's an honest one in town, but I haven't seen one. They all say they don't talk, but then I look at their handiwork, and it's dirty handiwork, right? Their hands are dirty. What they're doing is they're topping trees, so they got to be called in basically every year, right? So that's what. So I'm sure there are some honest physicists out there. The technologists tend to be that way, but the theoreticians are intellectually dishonest. The quantum mechanics, as I call them, they are fooling themselves, and even more are fooling others. They're fooling themselves into thinking they're basically infallible.
People are responsible for their own acquisition of knowledge. It's if a person's fooled, it is really their own fault, honestly.
You mean fooled by others?
Yes.
Well, exactly right.
I mean, we live in a society where it has, where people specialize, and they know nothing of anything else. And if anybody tries to learn a little bit of this, a little bit of that, then somebody will come along and say, well, jack of all trades, master of none. And it's like everybody else out there is like a master of no trades and a jack of maybe one, and
well, one, exactly right. They're a jack of one,
but they don't see it that way, and really people should strive to know as much as they can on subjects. The information's out there. I mean, yes, there's a lot of junk on the internet. You really have to sift, and you have to, but that's part of the knowledge process, right? You have to be able to look at something and go, wait a minute, what's this person selling? Where are they coming from with this information? And, what kind of biases can I expect from them? You know, like I was talking to your brother a while back, and I said something to that effect that, well, everybody has their biases or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it shouldn't be that way. And he seemed shocked, you know, he seemed like this was the first time he'd ever heard about this or whatever, and it shouldn't be that way. And it's like, okay, but everybody has their biases. Everybody. He does, you do, I do, you know, and we want to even be able to trust our own judgment. But in order to do that, we have to realize that we are just as able to be flawed in one area or whatever, and be more willing to accept one truth than another, or whatever. We are all that way, right? So if you don't recognize that in yourself, what in the world are you living in, kind of thing, you know, where you have to be able to understand that everybody has their biases, and that's like the first step in learning from other people, is to question it, is to question, well, where is this coming from, and can I really trust this information, and perhaps I should get a second and a third and a 300th opinion on the subject, and then, you know, go back to some sort of experimental data, you know, and then question the biases there, right?
Yeah.
All
if
the
you
time, right?
can't get experimental stuff, look at experience. And what you want to look at is the primary sources. It's emphasized in history. You don't want to read some guy or gal's interpretation of what Einstein said. You want to read the original stuff, right? Hopefully in German. That's why it's important to learn other languages. So, you got to be skeptical about it. Everyone thinks, and the person you got to be most skeptical about is yourself. And that's why it's important to look at experiments, do experiments, and actually do a little bit of work with logic, do a little bit of work with stats, all that sort of stuff. And then when you're looking at stuff, apply it really carefully, because you can fool yourself so quickly. And of course, most people aren't even willing to fool themselves. They let other people do it for them. It's appalling. And then they'll hammer down on you when you tell them, well, it's a crock. So, anyway, enough of a rant. Is it okay if I have these?
No! Those fell on the ground. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I haven't washed them yet.
Okay.
I'm glad I caught you before you stabbed
you
them.
did. Yeah. Could have washed it for it.
I'm sorry.
I thought you would go, wow, maybe saving it for the dogs.
Oh, I hurt my rib the other day, and it's still hurting. I can't
The laughing wouldn't help.
Well, dogs jumping on it doesn't help.
No.
But anyway, I got to get back to getting work done. So breakfast was good?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Good.